The cold came first, the way it always did at the Verith transit platform. Not the cold of weather, but the cold of bureaucracy, of fluorescent panels humming at frequencies designed to discourage lingering. Mira had been standing in line 7 for 4 hours. Her feet had stopped hurting somewhere around hour 2. Now, they were just part of the floor. She kept her eyes on her mother. Catalina sat in the repurposed cargo chair Mira had dragged from the secondary waiting bay, wrapped in the gray thermal blanket that smelled of antiseptic and the back seat of their old transit pod, the one they'd sold 6 weeks ago to pay for the crossing permits. Her mother's eyes were closed. Breathing had that new quality to it, shallow and deliberate, like every exhale was a small decision. The doctors on Sector 9 had called it progressive pulmonary collapse. They had said this without expression, the way mechanics describe a worn-out part. They had given her 8 months, maybe 10, if she remained in low gravity. That had been 7 months ago. "She's at 83%, said a voice near Mira's knee. She looked down. X was sitting on his haunches beside her, his optical sensors scanning the crowd with the lazy sweep of a dog watching birds through a window. He didn't look like much. He'd been modeled on a Belgian shepherd, the same long muzzle, the same upright ears. But 3 years of hard use had worn the synthetic fur from his left shoulder and the lower half of his snout, revealing the matte black polymer skeleton beneath. His tail had a slight hitch in its movement, from where Mira had reset the servo motor herself, using a tutorial video and a borrowed torque wrench. The winter she turned 13. 83 is okay, Mira said. It's lower than an hour ago. I know the atmosphere recyclers in this section are running at reduced capacity. Particulate level is. Rex. Yes, I know. She reached down and rested her hand on top of his head. The polymer was cool under her fingers. Nothing like the warmth of a living animal. But she'd stopped noticing that years ago. He leaned into her hand slightly, a gesture his designers had probably called a comfort response, and which Mira had always thought of as simply Rex being Rex. The line moved 3 meters. She moved with it, pushing the chair. Her mother stirred. How much longer? Not long. Catalina opened her eyes. They were the same dark brown they'd always been. Still sharp when the fog of the medication lifted. You're lying. A little. Her mother almost smiled. It used the left side of her face more than the right now, a habit born of the breathing tube attachment she wore during sleep. Your aunt's going to meet us at Harvin Station. I know, Mama. She said she'd bring food. Real food, not the compressed. I know. Mira kept her voice steady. She had memorized this conversation across a dozen repetitions over the past week. Her mother's short-term memory was fragmenting. Another symptom, another small erosion. And she cycled through the same reassurances the way water cycles through the same grooves in stone. Mira answered each one like it was the first time. It cost her something she didn't have a name for. She paid it anyway. The line moved again. They were 3 stations away from the processing gate when the Veth soldiers arrived. She heard them before she saw them. The particular clatter of Veth armor, the overlapping click of their rebreather unit cycling, the flat percussion of their feet on the platform deck. They moved through crowds differently than humans did. Humans navigated. Veth displaced. The crowd parted not because people were polite, but because the Veth were a head taller than anyone else in the hall, built along principles of mass and solidity that made standing in their path feel less like rudeness and more like poor engineering. There were 6 of them. Standard transit enforcement. Their exoshells were the dull gunmetal gray of the Veth Transitional Authority, the bureaucratic branch, not the military, which meant they were here for papers and compliance and fees rather than for violence. Although the distinction, in Mira's experience, could blur, the lead soldier stopped at the head of line 7. Its rebreather translated its Veth into flat, clipped standard. Transit documents. Secondary screening. All passengers. The line compressed. People began reaching for their credential chips. The nervous shuffle of a crowd that has learned compliance. His ear tilted 45 degrees, his alert posture. Their scanners are calibrated for Veth biometrics, he said quietly. Your mother's MedPass is flagged for secondary review under Ordinance 7.14. Progressive pulmonary cases. They've been pulling them from transit queues at Harvin and Cresswind for the last. How do you know that? I've been monitoring the authority transit feed since we arrived. Mira looked at the soldiers. She looked at her mother, who had fallen back into a light doze, her breath slow and considered. She looked at the processing gate, still 3 positions away. Beyond it, through the transit corridor and 2 pressure doors and a 2-hour shuttle ride, was the Harvan colony on Proxima Station, a lower gravity environment, filtered air, tubes. Doctors who had access to the full spectrum of pulmonary therapies that the authority restricted from Sector 9 on the grounds of regulatory compliance, which was a phrase that, as best Mira could tell, meant the medication was available, but the paperwork to get it here would take longer than her mother had left to breathe. She had been working toward this gate for 11 months. Options, she said quietly. Rex's tail made its hitching sweep. 3 lanes are currently open. Lane 4 has a processing officer, human contracted, authority licensed, who has flagged 0 secondary screenings in the last 18 months. Statistically, how do we get to lane 4? You'd need to leave this line. The authority has stationed observation drones at the lane junctions, but their rotation pattern has a dead angle on the south approach every 40 seconds. However, moving your mother's chair across the transit deck in the current crowd density without. Show me. Rex's left optical sensor projected a faint overlay onto the floor in front of Mira, a pale blue wash, nearly invisible in the platform lighting, tracing a route through the crowd. It threaded between 2 cargo stacks, curved around a family group with 3 children, passed beneath an overhead service gantry that would block drone sightlines, and arrived at the lane 4 queue with 12 seconds to spare before the next drone rotation. Mira stared at it for 3 seconds. The thing about her mother's chair was that it had been built for a cargo bay, not a transit platform. It was wide. It was heavy. It had 1 wheel that drifted left if you didn't correct for it constantly. A fact Mira had learned through 11 hours of pushing it through 3 different transit hubs across the past month. She was 5'4" and weighed 53 kilos and had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in the past 9 days. She had also, in that time, learned to navigate 7 different authority transit systems, forged a secondary medical notation in a format that passed 2 different security scans, repaired Rex's primary sensor array with parts purchased from a salvage stall on the Cresswind platform, and talked her way past a level 3 checkpoint using documentation she'd prepared on a 6-year-old tablet in the sleeping bay of a transit hostel, while her mother coughed in the bunk beside her. She picked up the chair's handles. 40 seconds, she said. Starting now, said Rex. She moved. The crowd was thick, and she was not polite about it. She said, "Excuse me," twice, and after that she stopped saying anything and just pushed, the chair's wide base parting the crowd the way a prow parts water. Not gently, not apologetically, just by occupying the space and refusing to yield it. The drifting wheel tried to pull her left, and she corrected, overcompensated, corrected, again. Her arms burning with the effort of managing it across a floor that was not quite level. Rex moved ahead of her, not leading but clearing, his solid polymer bulk threading the gaps and subtly redirecting foot traffic with the kind of persistent, wordless insistence that she had noticed over the years worked on people the same way it worked on herding animals. Mother woke up as they rounded the cargo stacks. Mira, it's fine, Mama. Stay still. Where are we? Moving to a different line. Stay still. Catalina gripped the armrest. She didn't ask again. There were things she trusted about her daughter the way she trusted gravity. Not because she had verified them, but because they had never failed her. The service gantry passed overhead. 3 seconds of drone shadow. Mira counted them without meaning to. They arrived at lane 4 with 11 seconds to spare. The processing officer in lane 4 was a human woman, mid-50s, gray-streaked hair, pulled back with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested someone who had been doing paperwork in difficult conditions for most of her adult life. Eyes moved across Mira and the chair and Rex with a professional opacity that revealed nothing. Documents. Mira pressed her credential chip to the reader. Mother's med pass, the transit permits, the secondary medical notation, the Harvan arrival clearance. She'd gotten a retired transit attorney on Sector 9 to validate for 2 months of her own wages from the recycling bay. The officer scanned each one without expression. Rex sat, His tail made its small hitching movement once, and then went still. The officer looked up. Eyes went to Catalina, who had fallen asleep again, her head resting against the back of the chair, her breathing slow. Then she looked at Mira. Mira held it. She had learned, across 11 months and 17 transit checkpoints, and 6 secondary screenings and 2 customs holds, that the thing you could not do was look away. Not from apology, not from nerves. You looked at them the way you looked at a problem you intended to solve. Steady, present, patient in the way that is not passive, but is something harder. The patience of someone who has already decided they're going to be here when the other person finishes deciding. The officer's scanner beeped. The medical notation is formatted for Harvin's pre-transit intake protocol, the officer said. Yes, most people coming through Sector 9 file under the standard authority format. I know. A pause. Not long. The kind that has weight. Lane closure is in 8 minutes, the officer said. She turned to her terminal. I'd recommend you stay in this queue. She stamped the documents and passed them back. Mira released a breath she had been holding for a long time. The shuttle to Harvin left from Bay 12. It was, by authority standards, adequate, which meant the seats were bolted down, and the oxygen supply was functional, and the viewports were scratched but present. Mira got her mother settled in the accessibility section, locked the chair into the floor anchors, and sat beside her. Settled at her feet, his sensors powering down to standby. He would wake if anything changed. Through the viewport, the Verath platform receded, gray and enormous and indifferent, a machine built to process and permit and delay. Catalina reached out without opening her eyes and found Mira's hand. You smell like stress, her mother said. It's the platform. It gets into everything. No, it's you. Her mother's thumb moved across Mira's knuckles. Since you were little, you've had a smell when you're scared. Like metal. Mira said nothing. Were you scared today? For about 40 seconds. Catalina made a sound that was almost a laugh. My daughter. Seconds. Rex helped. Rex always helps. Her mother's voice was thinning at the edges, sleep pulling at it. You did the work. You always do the work. Mira looked at the viewport. Platform had shrunk to a shape now, a long horizontal mass against the dark. She watched it until it was gone. The thing about Harvin that the authority pamphlets mentioned, and then immediately minimized, was that it had been built by humans in the early colonization period. Before the Veth Transitional Authority had assumed administrative control of the Proxima Corridor. What this meant, in practical terms, was that the engineering was older and messier, and more adaptable than the clean authority stations. Pipes ran along visible surfaces. Corridors branched unexpectedly. The air recyclers were a mismatched collection of 3 different generations of equipment, jury-rigged into a system that should not have worked as well as it did. And worked extremely well because the people maintaining it had been keeping things running on inadequate resources for 60 years. Mira loved it immediately. Aunt Davina was waiting at the arrival dock. She was a broad woman with her sister's eyes, and none of her sister's caution, and when she saw the chair she did not cry or reach for Catalina's hand, or make the face that people made when they were computing how much time was left. She said, "You're late. I've been standing here for 40 minutes. The food's going to be cold. Hello, Rex, you beautiful mechanical disaster." And she bent and scratched Rex behind his polymer ear, and Rex made the low-frequency hum that was the closest approximation he had to a purr. Catalina opened her eyes. Davina, who else? Davina crouched so she was level with her sister. How are you? Tired. You can be tired here, that's allowed. She looked up at Mira. There was a world of questions in it, deferred for later. Mira gave her a single nod. Davina nodded back. The medical intake at Harvin Station 7 took 3 days. On the first day, they established baselines. On the second day, a doctor, with an unpronounceable name and extremely steady hands, adjusted Catalina's oxygen protocol and began her on a filtration therapy that was not available anywhere on Sector 9. Third day, Mira sat in the waiting area outside the intake ward and ate a bowl of food she could not identify that tasted like something worth eating and did not look at her tablet or her credential chips or her transit permits. Rex lay beside her chair. After a while he said, "Her respiratory function has improved 4% in 48 hours. Mira stared at the ceiling. That's better than the projected baseline, Rex added. I know. The attending physician has reclassified her prognosis from palliative to Rex. Tell me later. Okay. She sat with it for a while. The waiting area was quiet. Institutional quiet. The kind that had been professionally installed and was maintained by soft acoustic panels and the occasional distant hum of the ventilation system. Child was sleeping across two chairs at the far end, curled around a stuffed something, their shoes still on, Mira said. Yes, when we were on the platform in line 7, yes. The route you projected, the timing, if I'd been 20 seconds slower. You weren't. But if I had been, Rex was quiet for a moment. His optical sensors rested on the middle distance. Then I would have found another route, he said. Another timing window. Or another lane. I would have kept finding options until we were through, or until there were no more options. And if there had been no more options. His ear tilted. The damaged ear. The one that didn't quite sit straight. I don't operate well in hypotheticals that have already resolved. Mira looked at him. He looked back, or as close to looking back as his sensor array allowed, which had always been close enough. Thank you, she said. You did the work. We did the work. Rex's tails made its small hitching sweep. Yes, he said. That's more accurate. She slept for 14 hours that night. She did not dream. Or if she did not remember it, which amounted to the same thing. When she woke it was station morning, the overhead panel cycling up slowly, the way the designers had intended to simulate dawn. Rex was at the window of the small recovery suite. Davina had arranged, his sensors running their overnight environmental checks, with the patient thoroughness that had always made Mira think of the word devoted, though she'd never said it out loud. Sure. She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Harvin Station's ceilings were lower than the authority platforms, and the panels were older. And two of the light strips had that faint flicker that meant they needed replacement. The air tasted like recycled air. Every station did, but it had something in it that the authority stations lacked. A quality she could not identify precisely. Maybe just the fact that the recyclers had been maintained by the same families for 60 years. And something of that care had gotten into the system. She got up. Mother was 3 rooms down the corridor, past the door that required a medical access code that Mira had memorized on day 1, in a room with a window that looked out at the interior atrium of the station. A garden space the original builders had included, against all practical logic, in the middle of what was supposed to be a purely functional transit hub. It had plants in it. Real ones under grow lights, tended by 2 elderly residents who had been tending them since before Mira was born. Catalina was awake when Mira came in. She was sitting up, which she hadn't been able to do without assistance since the 2nd month, and the thing on her face was not the medication-assisted smile Mira had been getting for the past 4 months, but the actual one, the lopsided one that used too much of the left side. The one Mira had known her whole life. Look at this garden, her mother said. Mira looked. Through the window under the grow lights, something was blooming. She didn't know what kind of plant it was. Something with small yellow flowers arranged in clusters, nothing she recognized. It's nice, Mira said. I used to have a garden. When you were very small. Do you remember? No. You used to eat the dirt. Her mother laughed, and the laugh was good. It was real. It was a sound Mira had been conducting most of the previous year toward. Just handfuls. I couldn't stop you. The doctors said children do it for the minerals sometimes. I was getting minerals. You were getting filthy is what you were getting. Her mother patted the bed beside her. Mira sat. Catalina reached up and pushed Mira's hair back from her face, the way she'd done when Mira was small, with the same unhurried attention. You look terrible. I'm fine. You look like someone who hasn't slept in a year. 9 months, that's not better. I know. Her mother's hand rested on the side of her face. Warm, slightly rough. The same hands that had pressed cold cloths to Mira's forehead through fevers, that had done homework at the kitchen table across from her, that had, 11 months ago, held a medical report from the Sector 9 clinic, and been very still for a very long time before folding it carefully and placing it face down on the counter and saying, with a steadiness that had terrified Mira, "We'll sort it out. I never asked you to do this," her mother said. "I know, all of it, everything you did. Mama. I need to say it. Okay, her mother looked at her. The garden was behind her. The yellow flowers, small and precise under their artificial light, growing the way things grow when someone has decided they're going to grow regardless. So proud of you, she said. I don't have a word for what I am. Proud isn't big enough. Mira said nothing for a moment. Rex helped, she finally said. Her mother made a sound. Where is he? In the suite, running environmental checks. He does that every morning. Every morning. Since I was 9. Mira paused. He was running them before I woke up. I think he's been running them all night. Catalina was quiet for a moment. Then, you should tell him thank you. I did. Tell him again there was a dispute. She had been expecting one. In the way you expect a storm. When the pressure has been dropping for days. The Veth Transitional Authority had a processing office on Harvin, smaller than the ones on the main stations, staffed by 2 contracted human officers and 1 Veth compliance monitor, who was present via holographic relay and who carried, in Mira's assessment, the specific energy of someone who had been assigned to a post they considered beneath their capabilities. The issue, as the compliance monitor explained through the flat translation of the relay interface, was that her mother's reclassification from palliative to active treatment created a documentation discrepancy with the original transit application, which had been filed under a palliative care exemption, and that under Ordinance 19.7, 3 of the Proxima Corridor Transit Code, a change in medical status required a secondary application filed at the originating transit hub before long-term residency could be approved. The originating transit hub was Sector 9. Sector 9 was 14 hours away by shuttle. The compliance monitor finished its explanation and regarded Mira through the relay interface with an expression that she had encountered enough times, across enough bureaucratic encounters, to understand precisely. This is the wall. This is where most people stop. She did not stop. The ordinance you've cited, she said, is a 2031 amendment to the Proxima Transit Code. The transit permit we filed was submitted under the pre-amendment framework under the grandfathering clause of the 2034 Corridor Agreement. The compliance monitor paused. This was a physical pause, the pause of a body that had been resting on the assumption of resolution and was now recalibrating. Beside her projected a faint shimmer onto the desk surface, a document reference, case number, and filing date, not large enough to be visible to the relay interface but legible to Mira. I'll need documentation of that claim, the compliance monitor said. Of course. She placed the tablet on the desk. She had prepared the documentation 3 weeks ago, in the sleeping bay of the Cresswind Transit Hostel, after Rex had flagged the possibility of a status change dispute, and they had spent 4 hours reading Proxima Transit Code amendments together in the dark. Mira cross-referencing on the tablet, and Rex cross-referencing in his internal database, and both of them, in the particular focus quiet that had always characterized their best work, building the case. The compliance monitor reviewed the documents. It reviewed them for quite a long time. Mira sat with her hands in her lap and did not fidget. This is a non-standard filing format, the compliance monitor said eventually. It's the format specified in the 2034 grandfathering clause, Mira said. I have the original regulatory text if you need it. Another pause. Then, the filing format is acceptable. She walked out of the compliance office into the station corridor, where Davina was waiting, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral, fell into step beside her. Well, Davina said, we're approved. Davina uncrossed her arms. She looked at Mira for a moment, with an expression that was not quite what she had expected from an aunt, which was relief or pride or warmth. It was something more complicated. The look of someone who is seeing a person clearly, maybe for the first time, and is taking a moment to understand what they're looking at. How did you know about the grandfathering clause? Davina asked. Mira glanced at Rex. We read a lot of transit code. 3 weeks later, she found her mother in the atrium garden, sitting in a chair that someone had placed on the path between the grow light beds. With her face turned up toward the artificial light and her eyes closed. She was not wearing the oxygen attachment. Her breathing was slow and even and unassisted. Mira stood at the garden entrance and watched her for a while. Rex was beside her. His damaged ear was tilted at its permanent slight angle. His tail made its hitching movement. 91%, he said quietly. Up from 83. In 3 weeks, Mira nodded. She didn't say anything for a moment. One of the elderly gardeners was working at the far end of the path, doing something careful and unhurried with a plant that was coming in, its stems still pale and tentative under the lights. The gardener moved with the economy of someone who has learned over a long time exactly how much attention each thing needs, and has stopped trying to give it more or less than that. Myra said. Yes. What are we doing tomorrow? His sensor swept the atrium. At 0800 your mother has a respiratory assessment. At 1100 you have a meeting with the Harvard Education Registry regarding the apprenticeship program. 1400 I have scheduled a maintenance window for my left shoulder actuator, which has been running 12% above normal friction levels since Cresswind. I can fix that. I know. That's why I scheduled it. Mira looked at her mother, who had not moved, who was sitting in the light with her face tipped up, breathing. There was a word for what she felt, she thought. There was probably a precise word in some language she didn't speak for the specific quality of relief that arrives after an enormous effort has ended, and the outcome has been what you most needed it to be. And you have had enough sleep to feel it properly. She didn't know the word. She wasn't sure she needed it. Okay, she said. She walked into the garden. Mother heard her footsteps on the path and opened her eyes, and the smile came, the real one, the left-sided one. And she held out her hand. Mira took it, settled beside the bench, his sensors at rest, his damaged tail making its small hitching sweep in the artificial light of the garden, where something had decided to bloom.